They pulled him out of line like trash, shoved him aside without a word of protest from the crowd. Not because he posed a threat, not because he caused a scene, but because his skin was black and his silence didn't look submissive enough. They laughed, they whispered, they flexed the little power they had, certain no one important would ever come dressed like that, walking alone, carrying no badge of status, but dignity itself. What they didn't know is that the man they humiliated could snap their future in half with a single signature. This isn't just a story about race, it's a slow-burn disaster of arrogance, of people mistaking silence for weakness and mistaking a black elder for someone who wouldn't be missed. If that sentence hit you like this video, if you've seen this kind of thing happen where you are, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe some stories deserve to end with justice punching upward, make sure you subscribe. We're just getting started. The morning sun filtered through the tall glass panels of the Rosemont Conference Center, a building of sleek marble floors and gleaming brass railings. The entry hall buzzed with voices, dress shoes clicking, and the low murmur of excitement surrounding one of the nation's most prestigious corporate equity summits. Attendees moved with quiet confidence, badges dangling from necks, portfolios tucked neatly under arms, and tailored suits pressed with perfection. Among the well-dressed crowd, Harold J. Whitaker stood near the middle of the security check-in line, his posture composed, his eyes calmly scanning the room. He wore a navy blue blazer, slightly faded with time, and held a simple leather folio under his arm. His silver beard was neatly trimmed, and his polished shoes, though not new, shone from care rather than cost. He moved up a step as the line advanced, keeping a respectable distance behind the woman in front of him, who never once looked back. The line snaked between retractable stanchions, and at the far end stood a security station staffed by 3 men in black polos. Scott, the tallest of the trio, carried himself with a mix of self-importance and alertness, scanning each face with the expression of someone trained to expect trouble. As Harold approached the front, Scott narrowed his eyes. There was no obvious reason to be suspicious. Harold carried no bags, had cleared the metal detector without issue, and had his ID ready in hand. Still, Scott's gaze lingered a beat too long before he took a step forward, abruptly raising his hand in the air. A few heads turned. The noise level dropped just enough for Scott's voice to cut through. He didn't lower his volume when addressing Harold, though everyone else had been greeted with polite nods and quiet instructions. Instead, he gestured forcefully at Harold's position in the line and stated that he was violating protocol by standing too close to the next guest. It was a blatant exaggeration. Harold had observed every rule without error, but the accusation stood. Several people turned to stare. A few shifted away, their expressions stiffening. Harold didn't speak. He simply stepped back half a foot, despite having done nothing wrong. His movement was deliberate, non-confrontational, and entirely too dignified for Scott's taste. The guard's eyes narrowed again. The woman in front of Harold glanced over her shoulder for the first time and immediately took in the situation. Her gaze lingered for half a second, then flicked away with clear disapproval. She stepped forward quickly, eager to distance herself. Behind Harold, murmurs began to grow. A suited man coughed and muttered something under his breath about people not knowing how to behave in professional settings. Another smirked, adjusting his tie while pretending not to listen. Harold remained still, his ID still in hand. His eyes, unreadable behind square glasses, stayed focused on Scott. But Scott, sensing an audience now, wasn't about to retreat. He motioned to another guard at the desk and pointed at Harold. The gesture was too exaggerated to be casual. It was a performance, one clearly meant for those watching. The second guard nodded, though he hadn't seen any misconduct. The line continued moving slowly, with Harold still under scrutiny. 2 people who had just arrived were ushered into a separate fast lane, both greeted with smiles by the other guard. They were white, dressed sharply, and received none of the inspection Harold faced. He turned slightly to let them pass, stepping aside with the same politeness he had shown all morning. Scott crossed his arms and waited, saying nothing, as if daring Harold to object. A digital sign above the desk blinked with the name of the summit and the logos of several corporate sponsors. Harold looked up at it briefly, then returned his attention to the front. A third security staff member, clearly younger and newer, looked at the interaction and hesitated. He glanced at Harold, then at Scott, unsure of whether to intervene. But he said nothing. When Harold finally reached the front of the line, Scott stepped forward again. His tone wasn't accusatory this time, it was flat, clinical, but laced with the quiet condescension of someone who believed he was in control. He asked for Harold's name, but didn't write it down. He didn't check the ID. Instead, he squinted, paused for effect, then told Harold to wait to the side while they verified something. The instruction was unnecessary. No one else had been asked to wait to the side. Still, Harold moved without protest, standing near a brass pillar just beyond the check-in desk. The others passed by him one by one, some glancing curiously, others ignoring him entirely. The murmur of conversation resumed, but the tone had changed. Harold could feel it, the subtle shift in temperature that came when judgment hovered in the air. And his presence, for reasons Scott seemed determined to escalate, was being transformed into an object of spectacle. Without warning, Scott turned back toward Harold and raised his voice with sharp clarity, asking whether Harold had been instructed not to move. The line of people behind him turned again, startled by the volume. A few frowned. Others watched with subtle anticipation. They didn't need context. The tone alone was enough to validate their assumptions. Harold did not reply. He hadn't moved at all. His composure remained unchanged, but Scott wasn't looking for answers. He was creating a scene. Scott continued, questioning aloud whether Harold had misunderstood directions, asking if he needed further explanation. His voice projected over the marble walls, calculated and loud enough to draw attention from the upper balcony, where event organizers occasionally peeked. Again, Harold stood motionless. His silence, instead of calming the situation, only seemed to irritate Scott further. The security guard strode toward the reception desk, where a woman named Becky sat behind a frosted glass counter. Becky had been scanning badges and offering programmed smiles to arriving guests all morning. She barely looked up as Scott approached, leaning in slightly as he began speaking, though his tone no longer carried the artificial politeness he reserved for guests. Becky flicked her eyes toward Harold briefly. Just a glance. Just long enough to see the gray hair, the dark skin, the outdated blazer. Then she looked back down at her screen and shrugged. Scott leaned over the counter and said something low. Becky rolled her eyes and responded in a voice loud enough for Harold to hear. "He's not on the list. I don't care what he says." There was no effort to verify, no typing, no scrolling. Her fingers remained still, poised over a keyboard she had no intention of using. Scott chuckled under his breath and turned to face Harold again. Harold said nothing, though this time he did lift his chin slightly. It wasn't defiance. It was presence. A group of conference attendees exited the elevator and approached the registration area, their conversation pausing as they walked past the scene unfolding. One of them, a middle-aged man in a red tie, slowed just enough to absorb what he saw, then leaned over to whisper something to the woman beside him. She nodded without breaking stride. They kept walking. Harold caught the glance, the half-smirk, the quiet dismissal. It was all familiar. The strategy wasn't new. It was the same pattern of passive isolation that had trailed him through decades of boardrooms and policy meetings. No raised hands. No slurs. Just intentional neglect dressed as protocol. Becky finally stood up, smoothing her blouse as if preparing for something important. She walked out from behind the counter and stood beside Scott, her arms crossed. Together, they presented a united front of subtle disdain, casting Harold as the anomaly in an otherwise seamless day. Becky pointed at Harold's ID. "Let me see that again." He offered it, holding it steadily, but she didn't take it. Instead, she leaned closer and squinted. Then she laughed softly, more to Scott than to herself. "Seriously? This guy says he's on the executive list?" She didn't try to hide the sarcasm. Scott grinned and shook his head. A young man in a beige suit, standing a few feet away, waiting for his own badge, turned his head slightly, registering what had been said. He hesitated as if considering stepping in, but then looked at Becky's expression and thought better of it. The silence returned, not empty, but saturated. Harold slowly returned his ID to his pocket, not because he accepted their judgment, but because it was clear judgment had already been made. This wasn't about verifying credentials. It was about humiliation without touch, punishment without accusation. The next few guests were ushered past him with cheerful greetings and quick scans. One woman, carrying a tablet and headset, waved excitedly at Becky and exchanged weekend plans while Harold stood still only feet away. Becky responded with a wide smile, ignoring the man in the blazer beside her entirely. Scott leaned against the wall with the satisfaction of someone who had neutralized a threat. But Harold had never been a threat. That was what made it all so clear. There was no urgency, no concern for security, no legitimate question of identity. Only a performance for the crowd, with Harold cast in a role he had never agreed to play. Becky had returned to her seat. Scott had resumed leaning against the reception desk, but neither had forgotten him. Their apparent disinterest was only a pause, a prelude to further steps designed to strip away dignity with the subtlety of policy. It didn't take long for the next move. Scott stood upright and walked back over with his shoulders squared, speaking loud enough once again to invite an audience. "I'm going to need more identification," he said, holding out his hand with a mechanical gesture. "Government-issued ID, work badge, event confirmation, anything else that proves you were invited here." Around them, no one else was being asked for more than a badge swipe. Guests strolled through with coffees in hand, laughing, nodding to staff, unbothered. Harold pulled out his leather folio and calmly removed a small, well-organized set of documents. He handed Scott a valid driver's license, a corporate identification card, and an official letter of invitation, each item clean, current, and fully compliant. He didn't speak as he extended the items, knowing that words would be twisted if given the chance. Scott took the documents without saying a word. He looked at the driver's license first, turning it over as if expecting it to be fake. His brow furrowed, not because something was wrong, but because nothing was. Then he picked up the corporate ID, glanced at the photo, and then at Harold's face with exaggerated slowness. After a beat of deliberate hesitation, he set the ID back down on the counter, too roughly, so it slid across the surface and spun to a stop facing the wrong way. Finally, Scott looked at the invitation letter. The header bore the emblem of the Whitaker Foundation. The text was typed in bold, formal serif font, addressed clearly to Harold J. Whitaker and stamped with the official seal of the event's executive committee. Scott held it with 2 fingers as though it were damp. Then, with the air of someone declaring final judgment, he dropped it on the desk. The paper made a soft slap as it hit, the sound more insulting than if he had shouted. "This doesn't mean anything," he said flatly. "Anyone can print something like this at home." Becky looked up and chuckled, as if on cue. "This whole situation is giving me déjà vu," she said, tapping her keyboard absent-mindedly. A few guests in the waiting area glanced over. Some smirked. No one intervened. Harold's hands remained at his sides. His back was straight. He didn't retrieve the documents immediately. Instead, he let the moment settle, let it hang in the air for everyone to breathe. His silence was sharper than any protest. Scott picked up the letter again, waving it slightly. "Did you receive this by mail or did someone email it to you?" Harold raised his eyes, not his voice, and met Scott's stare with steady clarity. "Email," he said. "PDF format. Authenticated by the sender." Scott dropped the letter once more, and this time turned to Becky with a shrug. "I'm still not convinced," he muttered. Becky stood up again and walked toward them. "Let's call the registration coordinator," she said. "Maybe they can confirm whether he's on some side list." They both ignored the fact that Harold's name was printed on the invitation. They also ignored that no one else had needed any such backup confirmation. Harold reached for his documents, gathered them with deliberate care, and placed them back into his folio. His movements were calm, almost ceremonial, the slow grace of someone refusing to let indignity disrupt self-possession. A security guard near the metal detector, a younger man named Luis, shifted uncomfortably as the exchange played out. He checked the badge scanner, pretended to adjust settings, but his eyes kept flicking toward Harold. He seemed to recognize the imbalance, though he said nothing. Scott turned his attention to the lobby again. A new wave of attendees had arrived, flooding the entrance with a sound of greetings and footsteps. Scott appeared irritated now, not because of Harold, but because the situation hadn't resolved itself the way he wanted. He had expected resistance, outrage, something he could weaponize into justification. But Harold's quiet presence left no opening. His restraint was not submission. It was strategy, and that made Scott uneasy. Becky pulled out her phone and began dialing a number, speaking too softly to be heard. Her eyes darted between Harold and her screen. After a few rings, she frowned and ended the call. "They're not picking up," she said. "Must be busy." Scott crossed his arms again and looked Harold up and down. "You'll have to wait here until we get confirmation. Could be a while. You understand?" Harold said nothing. He had already understood everything the moment Scott first raised his voice. This wasn't about identification. This wasn't about verification. This was a dance choreographed by insecurity and prejudice, performed under the guise of protocol. A few more guests passed through. One woman glanced at Harold, then quickly looked away. Another man took out his phone and pretended to check email, though his camera lens pointed squarely toward the scene. His identification had been returned, his documents ignored, and yet no resolution had been offered. There was no verification call, no attempt to consult the digital registry, and no manager summoned to clarify anything. Instead, time was used as a tool of exclusion, as if the sheer accumulation of minutes could justify the suspicion that had been manufactured. The lobby remained busy, the rhythm of check-ins never once interrupted by the show unfolding just off to the side. After a few more minutes, Scott walked over again, this time without the facade of politeness. His tone carried a new sharpness, the cadence of someone building a case out of thin air. "You've been standing here for a while now, sir, and you're causing a disruption." His voice was no longer loud, but calculated. It was the kind of voice that carried well enough to the surrounding area without sounding overtly hostile, designed to imply control rather than confrontation. Harold didn't respond. There had been no disruption, no raised voice, no physical movement, nothing but quiet presence. Still, Scott stepped back slightly and gestured to one of the other guards at the front, a broad-shouldered man with a crew cut named Brandon. The silent command was received instantly. Brandon nodded once and walked briskly toward Harold. A third guard, slightly shorter and younger, followed closely behind. Both approached without speaking, flanking Harold on either side with a quiet choreography of practiced removal. Brandon placed one hand near Harold's elbow, not gripping, but hovering just close enough to suggest authority. The second guard mirrored the position on Harold's other side. "Sir, we need you to step over here with us. We're going to ask you to leave the line while we assess the situation." Harold looked at each of them in turn, eyes level, unshaken. He didn't resist. He didn't argue. He simply nodded once, subtly, and began walking with them as if he had always intended to. As they escorted him away from the check-in area, murmurs began to rise again from those nearby. A few people leaned in to whisper behind hands. A man in a navy pinstripe suit smirked as the guards walked past. Another guest, standing with her phone in hand, turned her wrist slightly and began recording. She wasn't obvious about it, but neither was she hiding it. Her camera focused squarely on the older black man being led away without incident, framed on either side by silent white uniforms. The symmetry of the image said everything. It didn't need sound. The optics were enough. From the far end of the room, Becky glanced up from her desk and smiled, tapping her screen with satisfaction. Scott folded his arms across his chest, watching Harold's slow removal, like a director concluding a successful scene. Behind them, more guests arrived, filling the space with movement and shallow pleasantries. The energy returned to normal almost too quickly, as if purging Harold from the line had reset the balance of the morning. The guards didn't take Harold far. Just past the registration area, near the concierge desk, they stopped. Brandon turned slightly and spoke again, more softly this time. "We're going to ask you to wait here until we speak with our floor supervisor." Harold's eyes didn't move. He gave no indication of distress, only the same steady presence that had so clearly unsettled them. The second guard shifted his stance, folding his hands in front of him. Neither of them made eye contact. It was easier that way. A few feet away, the woman who had been recording lowered her phone and nudged the man beside her. They both glanced back toward the lobby doors, then at each other. He chuckled quietly and said something under his breath. She responded with a smirk. From their expressions, it was clear they felt no shame. What they had witnessed wasn't new to them. It was the same pattern they had seen before, and this time it merely served as mild entertainment. Harold remained still, his posture giving no weight to humiliation, no reaction to their theater. Every movement was measured, every silence intentional. He was no stranger to this kind of ritual. Rituals where power dressed itself in procedures and where dignity had to be guarded like an heirloom. Time passed slowly in the space near the concierge desk. The guards stood quietly. Occasionally, one of them would check his radio or glance back toward the security station. No one came to speak with Harold. No one offered an explanation. At the main entrance, a photographer for the conference's media team raised his camera to capture general lobby images. He paused for a beat, camera lens pointed toward Harold, then lowered it slightly before choosing a different angle. The image didn't fit the theme of corporate celebration. A senior black man being escorted by security, even calmly, wasn't something they wanted in the event's online photo album. It might raise questions. It might start conversations they didn't want. It was always the same. When you didn't fit the template of comfort, you were categorized as a disruption. Still, Harold waited. Not because he expected justice to emerge from within the building's walls, but because he understood the value of bearing witness without backing down. After several more minutes, during which guests continued to flow in and out without resistance, Harold turned slightly to Brandon and asked, evenly and without aggression, to speak to someone in charge. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. He simply stated it as a request made reasonable by the absurdity of how he'd been treated. Brandon hesitated for a moment, glancing across the room as if searching for backup in a place he didn't want to find himself alone. But before he could say anything, Scott re-entered the picture, walking over from the check-in desk with long, deliberate strides. Scott stood in front of Harold and shook his head slowly, lips curled in a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're not on any appointment list," he said, "so there's no one here who needs to speak with you. This is a high-level event, sir, and our leadership team doesn't take unannounced visitors, especially those we can't verify." He folded his arms as he spoke, a stance of performative authority meant to mask the hollowness of his logic. Harold didn't flinch. His gaze didn't waver. But inside the silence he carried, something shifted. A quiet tally of each slight, each indignity, each bureaucratic insult dressed in polite hostility. The younger of the two guards beside Harold looked down at the floor, then back up at Brandon, uncertain. He seemed uncomfortable, not necessarily out of disagreement, but from witnessing something he hadn't yet learned to accept as normal. Harold turned toward Scott once more. "I have already provided verification," he said. "I am requesting to speak to the person responsible for guest oversight. If there has been a mistake, it should be corrected." Scott scoffed, not loudly, but dismissively, then looked over his shoulder as if seeking an audience to witness his certainty. He waved one hand through the air, gesturing vaguely toward the registration desk. "You're free to leave anytime, sir. There's no rule keeping you here, but unless you're on our digital invite list, you don't get access." Simple as that. At the edge of the lobby, a group of interns had been preparing swag bags and arranging program guides on a long folding table. Most of them kept their heads down, focused on tape guns and spreadsheets. But one of them, a tall young man in a gray vest with a laminated badge reading event operations in turn, looked up. He had seen the scene from afar and watched long enough to understand that something wasn't right. He stepped away from the table, hesitated, then approached Scott carefully. "Excuse me, sir," he said. "I think I can help." I saw Mr. Whitaker's name on the early printout. I was sorting name tags this morning. I remember it because it was flagged as VIP priority. Scott turned his head slowly, the way someone might turn when a machine suddenly malfunctioned. His expression froze for a moment, then quickly morphed into a smile that masked tension. "That's very helpful, Jacob," he said with exaggerated patience. "But it's not your place to intervene in security protocol." Jacob blinked, confused. "I just thought, if his name's there, maybe it was just missed in the update. I can double check." Scott cut him off with a sharp tone. "I said it's not your place. Please return to your station and let security handle this." Jacob glanced at Harold, who hadn't moved, then turned back toward his table with visible discomfort. As he walked away, Becky approached from her desk, tablet in hand. She called Jacob over with a wave and tapped something into her screen. As he leaned in, she showed him the device briefly, then whispered something inaudible. Jacob's face changed. He looked startled, then nodded slowly. After a few moments, he returned to his table, quieter now, the bounce in his step gone. On Becky's screen, Jacob's name had been added to an internal note titled Process Concerns, flagged for review. She smiled slightly to herself as she set the tablet down. The system had reasserted itself. One step out of line, even for empathy, was marked. Not with rage, but with bureaucracy. Not with confrontation, but with record-keeping. Harold had seen it before. He had seen it in boardrooms when young analysts were punished for asking the wrong questions. In policy meetings where assistants were reprimanded for acknowledging injustice too openly. The lesson was always the same. Silence is rewarded. Witness is punished. He had simply paused, eyes sweeping slowly across the gleaming marble floor, the polished brass trim, the ornate banners fluttering gently from the mezzanine above, symbols of prestige and respect that somehow excluded him with uncanny precision. He reached calmly into the inner pocket of his blazer and pulled out a phone, an old model but immaculately kept, its screen smudged only by use, not neglect. He tapped a contact without hesitation and lifted the phone to his ear. The call rang only once. He didn't step away, didn't lower his voice, didn't look around to see who was watching. He simply said a single sentence, clear and deliberate. The tone wasn't forceful, but firm, measured. Something that had been rehearsed in silence, prepared not in defense, but in expectation. There was a pause as the person on the other end responded. Brief, affirming. Then Harold nodded once and ended the call. He returned the phone to his pocket with the same calm motion and adjusted the cuffs of his shirt beneath his blazer. No visible reaction followed. No announcement. No declaration of what came next. From behind the front desk, Becky had seen the entire exchange. Her lips curled into a smirk as she leaned back in her chair. She turned toward Scott, who was sipping from a paper cup and watching Harold with the idle amusement of a man confident in his position. Becky gave a theatrical eye roll and tilted her chin toward Harold's direction. "He's still pretending to be important," she said, too quietly for Harold to hear, but loud enough to share the joke with her colleague. Scott chuckled in return, tapping the side of his cup. "These guys always think looking serious is enough." Becky turned back to her screen, flicking through digital attendance records, as though any page might suddenly justify what had already been decided. Her fingers moved quickly, but her eyes remained half-lidded with disinterest. To her, Harold had already been categorized. Unnecessary, unqualified, unverified. His blazer was clean but unfashionable, his shoes polished but modest, his calm demeanor interpreted not as dignity but as false confidence. She couldn't imagine someone with influence arriving so quietly, dressed so plainly, carrying no entourage. She sighed again, shaking her head as if Harold's restraint was some elaborate ruse. Across the room, one of the junior staffers noticed the subtle exchange. She had been scanning badges at the far end of the check-in area, but her eyes kept drifting back toward Harold. She couldn't hear what was being said, but the body language was clear. Becky dismissing him, Scott maintaining distance, Harold remaining unmoved. The staffer hesitated, then looked down at her own list again, wondering if she should search the name one more time. She didn't. The tension in the room warned her not to. Harold remained still. Guests passed behind him, entering and exiting the event spaces, never quite acknowledging him directly. He was an object in the environment now, visible, unavoidable, but not to be engaged. A decorative obstruction. The architecture had swallowed him like a flaw in the marble, something staff were trained to avoid discussing. But Harold did not blend. That was the discomfort. His presence could not be ignored, no matter how many layers of protocol they draped over it. Minutes passed. Becky answered calls, smiled at other guests, and kept throwing occasional glances toward Harold, each one accompanied by a slight shake of the head or a knowing look shared with Scott. They had filed the incident away as nothing. They had convinced themselves it was handled. They had written the story and assumed the next page would turn without incident. But none of them noticed the subtle change in the lobby's energy. Near the front entrance, the concierge picked up his phone and nodded. A brief sentence was exchanged. He hung up quickly and straightened his tie. At the same time, the doors at the far end of the hallway opened with a hiss, and 3 figures entered. 2 men and a woman, all in dark suits, moving with quiet authority. They didn't glance around or hesitate. They walked with purpose, scanning the room only once before locking their eyes on Harold. Becky noticed them a moment too late. She frowned, her fingers pausing on the tablet screen. Scott looked up just as they passed the security checkpoint without stopping. The man in the lead, tall and sharp-eyed, whispered something to the second man beside him, who nodded and tapped at a device clipped to his belt. Within seconds, all 3 had reached Harold. They greeted him not with skepticism, but with deference, silent, efficient acknowledgement that came not from curiosity, but from familiarity. Harold offered a subtle nod, and the lead man turned toward the security desk without speaking. Behind him, the second man tapped his phone once, then looked toward the digital check-in kiosk stationed at the registration desk. The third, a younger man holding a folded tablet, already had Harold's profile pulled up, his screen glowing softly in the dim hallway light. Becky saw them too late. Her first instinct was confusion, followed instantly by a realization she wasn't ready for. She stood up, smoothing her blouse, eyes darting toward Scott, whose relaxed posture stiffened as the lead man passed within arm's reach. Scott turned slightly, his voice caught in his throat as the 3 men reached Harold. The tall one paused, extended his hand toward Harold with the familiarity of someone accustomed to working alongside him, and nodded with a tone that carried weight and purpose. Harold returned the gesture calmly, a subtle acknowledgement of shared understanding, not showmanship. The conversation between them was brief but loaded. "Sir, thank you for waiting. We're terribly sorry about the delay. You should have been brought upstairs immediately. We weren't notified of your arrival. We'll handle that now." With that, the third man tapped his tablet again, and within seconds, the central screen at the reception desk flickered. The lobby fell quiet as the large digital display above the check-in station updated. For months, it had displayed a rotation of logos, sponsors, and leadership figures associated with the summit. But now, as if cued by unseen hands, a new slide appeared. A bold banner with the words Whitaker Foundation in elegant serif font unfurled across the top. Beneath it was a photo of Harold J. Whitaker, taken in soft light, in a boardroom surrounded by policy advisors, followed by a title that silenced the room. Chairman, Whitaker Foundation. Principal Partner, National Equity Investment Coalition. Platinum sponsor of the Global Finance and Inclusion Summit. The same summit that was taking place in the very building where moments ago Harold had been dismissed, delayed, and disrespected. The screen rotated again to display a list of names: keynote speakers, committee board members, strategic advisors. Harold's name was listed twice, once at the top, once in bold. Becky stared at the screen, her lips parting just slightly, a flush creeping up her neck. Scott stepped back, visibly disoriented, suddenly unsure of where to put his hands. He looked toward Harold, then toward the tablet still in Becky's hands, as if the device had betrayed them. Becky instinctively tapped at her screen again, hoping to disprove what was now undeniable. The guest they had spent the morning humiliating was not only a confirmed VIP, but a cornerstone of the event's existence. A murmur rippled across the lobby. The man in the gray vest, Jacob, the intern who had tried to speak up earlier, watched the screen from across the room. His eyes widened, not in surprise, but in quiet confirmation. He had known. He had seen the name. He had been silenced for noticing. Now, the entire staff knew what he had tried to explain. One of the coordinators, standing beside the elevators, quickly adjusted his earpiece and turned away to speak into his mic. Other junior staffers, still sorting bags at the welcome table, exchanged glances. A few guests who had passed Harold earlier began whispering, suddenly aware that they had overlooked a figure far more significant than they had assumed. Harold remained still, but the expression on his face had changed. There was no gloating, no satisfaction, only a calm that had deepened into something unshakable. The tall man at his side gestured toward the elevators and began to escort him forward. As Harold walked, people instinctively stepped out of the way. The distance between him and the crowd widened, not enforced by security this time, but by recognition. The same people who had ignored him now cleared his path, unsure of what to say or how to act. He walked past Becky, whose hand still hovered above her tablet. She did not speak. She did not meet his eyes. Scott opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing to explain, nothing to justify. The screen said more than they ever could. The elevators opened with a soft chime, and Harold stepped inside with the three executives, disappearing into the upper floors reserved for leadership and keynote guests. As the doors closed behind him, the silence in the lobby thickened. No one resumed conversation right away. No one dared pretend they hadn't seen what had just occurred. Becky slowly lowered her tablet to the desk. At the far end, double doors swung open, revealing a conference room with panoramic views of the city and a long polished table already prepared for a meeting he hadn't scheduled, but now clearly owned. Waiting inside was the CEO of the hosting organization, a man in his late 50s with carefully styled hair, a branded lapel pin, and the practiced smile of someone used to navigating powerful rooms. But today, that smile faltered. He rose quickly as Harold entered, stepping forward with a bowed head and extended hand. "We are deeply honored to have you here, Mr. Whitaker, and we sincerely apologize for the unacceptable treatment you received upon arrival. I was just made aware, and I assure you this is not representative of how we do business. We are conducting a full review as we speak." His tone, measured but strained, carried the edge of panic, controlled but undeniable. He gestured for Harold to sit, but Harold remained standing. He didn't need a chair to claim authority. His presence filled the room without effort. Behind the CEO, a young executive assistant scrambled to adjust the agenda on a digital tablet, quietly removing items and pulling up the financial dashboard associated with the Whitaker Foundation's endowment. She tapped quickly, her face pale. Everyone in that room now understood exactly who Harold was. Not just a respected donor, not just a figurehead, but the man whose influence anchored the summit's prestige and financial stability. The CEO turned toward one of the men who had escorted Harold, whispering something urgent. The man nodded and left the room immediately, taking the elevator back down to the lobby. Moments later, Scott received a call through his earpiece. His jaw tensed as he listened, nodding silently. Becky, still seated at her desk, looked over in confusion. Scott ended the call without speaking. A second later, both their names lit up on the main control console, a quiet internal signal that they had just been entered into an active investigation file. Back upstairs, Harold finally spoke, his voice calm and even. "I came here today as a partner, not as a problem. But what I experienced was neither an accident nor an isolated event. It was a reflection, one that your organization will now have to confront directly." The CEO opened his mouth, prepared to offer another apology, but Harold raised a hand slightly, silencing him without force. "I don't need an apology. I need accountability." With that, he turned toward the assistant still standing near the tablet. "Please open the Foundation's discretionary funding portal." The assistant hesitated, then obeyed. The screen blinked, displaying a secure portal that only Harold could access. With one signature, He could release or freeze funding across dozens of initiatives. Harold reviewed the dashboard. The summit's host organization was slated to receive the next installment of a $900 million grant. Funding that supported outreach, educational partnerships, internal equity training, and the very salaries of some of the people who had treated him with contempt just hours earlier. He tapped the screen once, reviewed the confirmation prompt, and authorized a freeze. The status bar shifted from green to red. A new notification appeared. Payment cycle paused. Further review required. The assistant looked up, visibly stunned. The CEO sat down, his hands clasped tightly on the table, fingers white from pressure. Downstairs, Becky received a new message on her screen. Her credentials had been temporarily suspended. The tablet locked. She tapped twice, then again harder. Nothing worked. Scott, still seated at his post, watched as two men in suits approached the front desk. They asked to speak with both him and Becky privately. He swallowed hard, suddenly aware that every moment of the morning had been recorded, time-stamped, and now reviewed. Harold remained in the boardroom a few minutes longer, answering a few direct questions from the executive staff, not with emotion, but with clarity. "This is not about revenge," he said. "It's about standards. You say equity is your mission. Then it must also be your practice. If your staff cannot identify dignity when it stands before them, they are not qualified to represent this organization." He didn't need to raise his voice. His authority was inherent, earned, indisputable. Outside the building, a black sedan had arrived, unmarked but clearly official. It waited at the curb, engine quiet, windows tinted. Word had begun to spread, not just inside the event, but across industry circles watching the summit in real time. News traveled fast in these circles. Faster still when connected to money. A social media post from one of the guests who had recorded the earlier encounter was beginning to go viral. Scott received the first formal notification through his earpiece, a brief instruction to report immediately to the Human Resources office on the 3rd floor. His hands, steady all morning, now shook slightly as he pulled off his security badge and placed it on the desk, his mind racing through every word he had spoken, every glance he had offered, every step he had taken from the moment Harold had walked through the door. The silence that followed him as he left the lobby was thicker than any applause he'd ever received during morning security briefings. There were no farewells, no supportive nods, only the quiet withdrawal of colleagues who now viewed him as radioactive. Becky's fall came less subtly. Her tablet locked again, this time with a blinking red warning across the screen that read, "Administrative access revoked." An alert followed instantly, Directive 4.2, immediate suspension. Internal bias, complaint pending. She stood slowly, glancing toward the few remaining interns at the welcome table, who now looked away or down, avoiding her eyes. A woman in a dark suit approached, clipboard in hand, and asked Becky to accompany her to an internal meeting room. Becky tried to maintain her usual posture, but her body betrayed her. Her steps were stiff, her hands clenched too tightly at her sides, and the confident smirk that had defined her earlier interactions had vanished. Within the hour, internal communications channels lit up with notices. Staff-wide updates referenced a temporary restructuring of the check-in and security teams due to procedural misconduct under investigation. No names were mentioned, but everyone knew. The conference floor buzzed with careful whispers. Some tried to appear neutral, others concerned, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. The system had protected them until it didn't. The moment the curtain was pulled back and Harold's identity exposed, the weight of their everyday behavior transformed from harmless oversight into professional liability. The clip that had begun circulating on social media was now on news sites, accompanied by headlines that didn't name Harold directly, but emphasized the summit's failure to uphold its own equity mission. Security guard berates elderly black man before being exposed on live feed, one headline read. Another, more direct, featured two side-by-side stills from a video, one of Harold being escorted away, and another of him being greeted upstairs by top executives. The contrast was stark, the narrative undeniable. In comment sections, former employees, activists, and public figures chimed in. Some demanded apologies. Others demanded resignations. A few simply asked, how many more have they treated this way who weren't connected? Scott's photo soon followed. Someone dug through old press releases and found his image from a previous security award event. And within hours, it had been recontextualized as a symbol of performative vigilance, masking personal prejudice. A hashtag trended briefly. Influencers reshared the footage. Industry leaders watched closely. By the next morning, Scott received a formal notice of termination, citing breach of conduct, failure to uphold organizational values, and reputational damage to event stakeholders. He tried to appeal, claiming he was following procedure, but the video had no sound and needed no translation. His posture, his tone, his dismissive gestures, all framed him clearly as the aggressor. Becky's dismissal took slightly longer, as her role was considered administrative rather than field-facing, but the outcome was the same. A public statement issued by the summit committee announced that the staff member responsible for guest relations had been removed from her position after a review of internal correspondence revealed a pattern of biased decision-making. Though she was not named in the statement, anyone who had been in the lobby that morning knew exactly who the message referred to. Becky left the building through a side entrance, avoiding the media vans now parked outside, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like metallic vultures circling. She had not spoken to the press. She had not issued an apology. Meanwhile, Harold remained quiet. He did not post. He did not comment. He did not offer sound bites or statements to clarify his actions. He didn't need to. The truth had done the speaking for him. And in its wake, institutions scrambled to reaffirm their commitment to dignity, diversity, and inclusion. Emails were sent. Training was rescheduled. Directors issued apologies they had hoped never to need. 12 months passed, not quickly, but with a kind of deliberate pace that allowed everything to change quietly, layer by layer. The incident that began with a quiet man being disrespected in a polished lobby had long since moved past trending hashtags and breaking headlines, but its impact endured like a watermark, faint, permanent, unmistakable. In the months that followed the summit, the organization behind the event undertook a series of reforms, policy rewrites, leadership reshuffling, transparency audits, and a renewed investment in community partnerships led by voices that had previously been marginalized. For many, it felt like just another public correction, a forced evolution of corporate branding. But for some, especially two individuals whose names had once been whispered with disdain, the change was something else entirely. Scott, no longer in uniform, now wore simple polos and sneakers as he walked into a small community center on the west side of the city each morning. The building was modest, painted in chipped beige, with posters on the walls about restorative justice and empathy-driven leadership. He had started volunteering there after months of unemployment, drawn first by guilt, then by discomfort, and eventually by the quiet insistence of reflection. The director of the center hadn't welcomed him with fanfare. Instead, she handed him a stack of chairs to move and said, "If you're here for real, get to work." So he did. He began by helping with logistics, setting up tables, organizing pamphlets, coordinating youth schedules. He didn't speak much. He just showed up every day early. Then one afternoon, during a workshop on bias and perception, the speaker didn't show. The room was full. No one moved. The silence was heavy. Finally, someone asked Scott if he wanted to say something. He stood awkwardly at the front of the room, unsure, then slowly began to tell the story. Not of Harold directly, not at first, but of the day everything changed. He didn't defend himself. He didn't deflect. He said plainly, "I thought I was just doing my job. But what I was really doing was protecting my comfort at someone else's expense." The room listened. That one talk turned into another, then a weekly session. Over time, Scott became a kind of reluctant teacher, never preaching, just sharing. His lessons weren't grand, but they were honest. And people responded, not because he was a hero, but because he wasn't. He became a living reminder that accountability could begin long after consequence, and that redemption required repetition. Becky's journey was different, but no less transformative. Her dismissal had been swift, and the silence from her former colleagues deafening. Doors that once opened easily now stayed shut. For months, she bounced between temp jobs, consulting gigs, and silent waiting. The world she had navigated with ease suddenly demanded reflection she had never been taught to perform. Then one evening, while walking past a local church basement with a handwritten sign that read "Job Skills Class Tonight, all welcome," she paused. Something made her step inside. The room was half empty, fluorescent lights flickering, but the people there were real. Young adults, single parents, returning citizens, people who weren't dressed for impressions, but for survival. She sat in the back, listened, and for the first time in a long while, didn't speak. Weeks later, she returned, not to sit, but to help. She offered to create resumes, to role-play interview questions, to rewrite cover letters. At first, no one trusted her. She didn't blame them. But slowly, with consistency and humility, she earned space. Her tone changed. Her posture softened. She stopped trying to control the room and started trying to understand it. The church allowed her to formalize a weekly session called Pathways Forward, designed to help underrepresented job seekers develop practical tools for employment in a system stacked against them. One night, during a local radio interview, the host asked what had prompted her shift. She paused, then said, "I met someone once who didn't need to raise his voice to hold the room. He didn't insult me. He didn't retaliate. He just stood there and let the truth reveal itself. That kind of presence stays with you." His name was Harold Whitaker, and I didn't see him until it was too late. That mistake cost me everything. But maybe now it can help someone else find a way in. Harold, for his part, remained mostly out of public view. He continued his work through the foundation, quietly supporting initiatives that empowered others to act where he had once stood alone. He never responded to interview requests. He didn't speak at summits or appear in documentaries. But once a year, on the anniversary of the summit's first day, he returned to the same building, not as a guest, not as a speaker, but simply as a man who refused to be erased. Staff now greeted him by name. New hires were told his story during orientation. A framed quote hung in the lobby above the welcome desk. Respect isn't given because of position. It's given because of presence. And presence, when dignified, commands more than any title ever could. That morning, as Harold walked through the same glass doors where his story began, the receptionist stood and smiled. "Good morning, Mr. Whitaker. We're honored to have you." He nodded, said thank you, and moved forward past the brass pillar where he had once stood, not as a guest, but as a mirror that had forced an entire system to look at itself and choose whether to change. The end. Before you go, if this story made you stop and think, even for a moment, hit that like button to help it reach someone else who needs to hear it. If you're watching from a place where this kind of injustice still happens, or if something in this episode reminded you of a real-life moment, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if you want more stories that don't just entertain, but reveal truth, make sure you're subscribed. You won't want to miss what's next. Would you like a version of this tailored for the beginning or middle of the video as well?